The wind arrived before she did. It tore across the frozen range at 31 knots, scattering loose snow into pale curtains that dissolved against the tree line. The mountains beyond did not move. They never moved. They simply watched, indifferent and enormous, the way mountains always do when small men prepare to do small things and call them glory. She stepped through the gate at 0547. No one noticed at first. The unit was already assembled on the far side of the range, clustered around a portable propane heater that hissed and spat against the cold. 11 men, veterans, most of them, the kind whose faces had been carved into permanence by altitude and sleeplessness, and the particular silence that follows a firefight. They passed a thermos between them without ceremony. Steam rose, disappeared. Then one of them saw her. He nudged the man beside him. The man looked. Then another. Then all of them. She was not what they expected. She was not what anyone expected. Small, perhaps 5'4" in her boots. The cold weather gear was regulation issue but slightly too large for her frame, the collar riding up past her jaw. She carried her rifle case in her right hand, not slung over her shoulder the way soldiers carry things for show, but hanging at her side, gripped low, like a commuter with a briefcase. She did not look at them. She looked at the mountains. "What is that?" said Corporal Brett Danforth. He had the particular quality of loudness that men acquire when they have never once been told to be quiet by someone they respected. Nobody answered him. Nobody needed to. The new girl crossed the range without breaking stride. Her boots left clean prints in the snow, methodical, evenly spaced. She stopped beside the empty rifle rack, set down her case, and stood with her hands folded behind her back, watching the far end of the range where the wind was doing something interesting to the snowpack. Sergeant First Class Wade Colburn finished the last of the thermos and handed it back to whoever had brought it. He was 41 years old, broad across the shoulders, with a jaw that had been broken twice and healed each time slightly wrong. He had served in 4 theaters and been decorated in 3 of them. He walked toward her the way a man walks towards something he has already decided is not a threat. "You're the new attachment," he said. It was not a question. "Yes, Sergeant." "Name?" "Cassidy Hale." He looked at her, the way men like him always look at things they don't yet know how to categorize. Then he nodded once, slowly, and walked back to his unit. "Snowdoll," Danforth said, just loud enough to carry. A few men laughed. Cassidy Hale said nothing. She was still looking at the mountains. The forward operating base sat in a valley between 2 ridgelines that the locals had long since abandoned. In winter, the wind moved through it like something alive, purposeful, with a destination in mind. The structure's prefab barracks, a supply depot, the operations hut, were bolted to the earth, with the grim practicality of men who knew the earth would try to reclaim them eventually. The unit was 3rd Platoon, Bravo Company, and they had been stationed here for 11 weeks. 11 weeks of high-altitude patrols, frozen equipment, and the slow particular madness of too many competent men crammed into too small a space with too little to shoot at. They were good at their jobs. They knew they were good at their jobs. This was both their strength and their primary social problem. Sergeant Wade Colburn ran the platoon with the economy of movement that comes from long practice. He did not raise his voice unless he had already decided to. He did not offer praise except when it was precisely calibrated to produce a specific result. He had been an adequate leader and an exceptional soldier for 19 years, and the distinction between those 2 qualities had never once troubled him. His inner circle consisted of 4 men. Corporal Brett Danforth, 27, who had the build of a man who had been lifting weights in the absence of a better hobby since he was 15. He was technically skilled with a rifle and personally insufferable about it. He kept a small notebook in which he recorded his shot distances and conditions, though he had never once reviewed the data in any analytical way. Specialist Marcus Webb, 32, who had come up through the Marines before crossing over, and who treated the Army's methods with the patient disdain of someone who has been forced to learn a second language, spoken by people he considers less sophisticated. He was quieter than Danforth, but more dangerous in the precise way that quiet men who have decided something are dangerous. Private First Class Dwight Hartley, 24, who laughed at everything Danforth said and would have followed him into a burning building, though mostly because he hadn't yet developed the judgment not to. And Sergeant Eli Pryor, 36, who was the only one of the four who had earned his rank through something other than duration. Pryor noticed things. He was good at waiting. He was good at watching. In a different unit, under a different structure, this would have made him the most valuable man in the platoon. Here, it made him the second loudest voice and the first to register doubt. Cassidy Hale was assigned to their rifle bay. She arrived at 0600 with her kit and her case and a face that expressed nothing, and she set up her position at the far end of the bay with the quiet efficiency of someone who has done this in worse conditions than this. She did not ask for help. She did not introduce herself beyond what was required. She laid her equipment out with the kind of spatial organization that suggested long habit, each item in a specific relationship to the others, each angled just so. Danforth watched this for approximately 90 seconds before he crossed the bay. "So, what's your specialty?" he said. He asked it the way men ask questions they already have answers to. "Long range," she said. He smiled. Pryor, from across the bay, watched the smile. "Long range." Danforth repeated it slowly, as if testing whether it tasted different the second time. "How long?" She was unpacking her data book, a worn, spiral-bound thing covered in handwritten columns. She didn't look up. "Depends on conditions." "Right." He glanced back at Webb and Hartley. "Well, conditions here are, let me put this nicely, not ideal for someone getting their feet wet." She set the data book down, squared its spine with the edge of the table. "Noted," she said. Pryor turned back to his own equipment. Something had shifted in the way the back of his neck felt. He had learned, over 36 years, to pay attention to the back of his neck. Outside, the wind dropped suddenly, and in the silence, you could hear the mountains breathing. The qualification range ran 800 meters along the valley floor. At 300 meters, paper targets. At 500, steel plates. At 800, a single, half-obscured steel silhouette that swayed slightly in the wind and had not been cleanly struck since the previous rotation departed. The range was set up for the platoon's weekly accuracy validation, a formality for men who already knew their numbers. It was not a formality for Cassidy Hale. Colburn had specified that all attachments would qualify through the standard sequence before being assigned to operational positions. This was not cruelty, it was procedure. The fact that it happened to place a new soldier in front of 11 men with something to prove was simply a condition of the environment. She took the position at lane 7. Danforth settled into lane 8, close enough that she would hear him without him needing to raise his voice. 300 meters. "Rookie," he said. "Wind's at your left. Don't overthink it." She was already in position. She had been in position for approximately 45 seconds longer than any of them had been watching her, which meant she had been in position before the exercise was formally announced. Pryor noted this. He filed it. The range officer called the first string. She fired. The round went wide. Not dramatically wide, not the kind of wide that produces gasps. Just off. Maybe 14 inches right of center. On a 300-meter shot in these conditions, with a wind that was doing nothing unusual, a miss like that was the kind of miss that made experienced marksmen look at each other with a certain expression. Danforth made a sound. It was not quite a laugh. It was the sound a man makes when a prediction is confirmed. "Breathe," Webb said from lane 6. He meant it as advice. It landed as condescension. She fired the second round. Wide again. This time left. 11 inches. "Oh, come on," Hartley said from somewhere behind her. The third round clipped the edge of the target. Just clipped it. The kind of hit that is technically scored, but that nobody would count in any environment where honesty was valued. Danforth stepped back from his own lane, which he had already completed with 3 solid center mass hits. He stood with his rifle at low ready and his head tilted to one side. "Hey, Hale." She didn't respond. "Hale." Louder. "You want to step back? Give someone else a turn?" She was already preparing her next round. Her hands were steady, steadier, Pryor noticed, than they had any reason to be given the results she was producing. That detail snagged somewhere in his thinking and would not release. "Drop the gun, rookie." Danforth said it with the particular satisfaction of someone quoting a line they've been waiting to use. Behind him, 2 men laughed. Hartley loudest. She set the rifle down, stood up, turned. She looked at Danforth for exactly 3 seconds. Not angry, Not embarrassed, not performing either of those things. She looked at him the way a person looks at a word in a foreign language that they understand but are choosing not to translate. Then she picked the rifle back up. "I'm not finished," she said. She completed the string. 2 more rounds. Both hit one center, one slightly above center, compensating for something in the wind that had shifted in the previous 40 seconds. Pryor was the only one who caught the adjustment. He watched her data book afterward, the way her pencil moved through columns. Wind speed, estimated adjustment, actual impact deviation. She was logging everything. Not the hits, not the misses. Everything. He didn't say anything about it. He wasn't sure, yet, what there was to say. The operations hut had no windows. This was intentional. Intelligence briefings in forward positions are conducted in the absence of natural light, for reasons that are partly practical and partly psychological. It is easier to discuss terrible numbers in a room that looks the same at midnight as it does at noon. They assembled at 1,900. The intelligence officer was a captain named Gerald Forsyth, who had the anxious precision of a man who has memorized the manual because the manual tells him what to do when something goes wrong. He set up his briefing materials with exacting care. Printed imagery, topographical overlays, a laser pointer he clicked on and off twice before beginning. "The target is here," he said, placing the pointer on a ridgeline approximately 7 kilometers north-northeast of the FOB. "A forward observer. Confirmed intelligence from 2 independent sources. He's been passing position data on our supply convoys. 3 attacks in the last 6 weeks. 31 casualties, combined." He let that number sit. "We need him removed," Forsyth continued. "The challenge is the position. He's set up here," the pointer moved, which puts him behind natural cover on 3 sides. "The only viable line of engagement is from this ridge to the south." Another move. The measured distance is 3,247 meters. Silence. Not the polite silence of a briefing where people are listening. The particular silence of men who have heard a number and are privately computing what it means. "That's not a real shot," Danforth said. He said it the way people say things they need to be true. "It's the only shot," Forsyth said. "At that range, and with those wind conditions, a conventional approach puts our personnel in exposed terrain for a minimum of 4 hours. The target moves every 36 hours. We have a 9-hour window." Colburn stood at the back of the room with his arms crossed and his face performing the specific blankness of a man doing very fast mathematics. "Who's our best qualified at distance?" "On record?" Forsyth hesitated. "Specialist Webb. Previous best confirmed engagement, 2,100 meters. Sergeant Pryor, 1,850. Webb said nothing. He was looking at the topographical overlay. "The wind alone makes this. I'd give it 5% at best. That's 5% if everything executes cleanly." "What about adjustment protocols?" Pryor asked. "At that distance, the Coriolis effect becomes a non-negligible factor," Forsyth said. "You're also dealing with density, altitude, temperature differential between the 2 positions, estimated wind speed at range versus at the firing point. Nobody in this unit can make that shot," Webb said. He said it without apology. It was not defeatism. It was the honest assessment of a professional. "I'll take it." The voice came from the far left wall, where Cassidy Hale had been standing since the briefing began. She had not raised her hand. She had not moved from her position. She had simply spoken, and the words occupied the room without her needing to make them louder. Every person in the room turned. "You," Danforth said. He laughed once, short and sharp, like something struck a nerve. "You couldn't hit a plate at 500 meters today." She looked at Forsyth, not at Danforth. "I'll need current atmospheric data, wind speed and direction at the target position and at my firing point, temperature gradient across the valley. And I'll need the exact topographical coordinates so I can calculate curvature correction." Forsyth's mouth had come slightly open. Colburn unfolded his arms. "Curvature correction?" Pryor said, very quietly. She turned to look at him. "At 3,247 meters, the Earth's curvature causes the surface to drop approximately 1.6 meters relative to a level line of sight. That needs to be calculated independently of the ballistic drop and included in the firing solution." A pause. "Standard practice for anything past 2,000. The room was very quiet. Colburn looked at Forsyth. Forsyth looked at Colburn. Some communication passed between them that had nothing to do with words. "Get her the atmospheric data," Colburn said. Pryor found her at 2100, sitting in the rifle bay with her data book open and a series of calculations spreading across the left-hand page in a handwriting so small and dense it looked like cartography. He sat down across from her without being invited. She didn't look up. "You've done this before," he said. It wasn't a question. He'd learned to stop asking questions when he already had the answer. She turned a page, added a column of figures. The atmospheric data came in at 1930. Wind at the firing point is averaging 23 knots with gusts to 31. At range, the best estimate is 18 knots from a slightly different angle. The thermal differential between the valley floor and the ridgeline is 11 degrees Celsius, which affects air density. I didn't ask about the shot. She stopped writing. "I'm asking about you," he said, "because your performance this morning looked like something deliberate, and the way you're working through that data looks like someone who's done more than qualify at a range." A long pause. Outside, the wind shifted direction. She noted this without looking up. Her pen moved to the margin, wrote a small number. "I missed," she said. "You corrected for a wind shift in the final 2 rounds that nobody else in the lane noticed until 30 seconds later." She set the pen down, did not close the book. The rifle bay was a long, low room with 4 bare bulbs hanging from a wire along the ceiling. At this hour, it held only the 2 of them and the particular institutional cold that settles into structures made from materials that were never intended to resist -14 degrees. A propane heater in the corner was producing more noise than warmth. The smell of gun oil and solvent was so embedded in the walls it would probably outlast the building. Pryor looked at her hands. They were completely steady on the edge of the databook. He looked at her face, which was giving him nothing. Not because she was withholding, but because she had simply gotten very good at storing things in places that didn't show. "My records are what they are," she said. "Your records?" He said it slowly. "I pulled your file after the brief. 3 entries. Basic qual, last assignment, and a transfer order dated 6 weeks ago. For someone your age, that's thin." "Files are administrative documents," she said. "They record what someone decided to put in them." "Right." He sat with that for a moment. "And what didn't someone decide to put in yours?" She looked at him then, not with hostility, with something more considered, the look of a person deciding how much of a truth to use. 11 years, she said. "Give or take." He did not react visibly. He had known, at some level, since the range, the corrections she'd made in the final 2 rounds were not the adjustments of someone developing skill. They were the adjustments of someone who had reduced 10,000 repetitions down to something that didn't even require thought anymore. They were reflex dressed as calculation. "The program," he said. "There were rumors. A few years back. Long-range precision unit, special applications, not attached to any standing command." She picked up the pen, returned to the column she'd been working on. "Rumors are interesting things," she said. "They're usually wrong about the details," he said. "Usually right about the shape." She didn't answer. The pen moved across the page. Pryor watched the numbers accumulate: elevation, correction, wind deflection, Coriolis adjustment, density, altitude modification, each figure built on the previous one. Each assumption was labeled and sourced. It was the kind of work that a computer did in seconds, and that she was doing by hand in a rifle bay at 2,100 inches, a forward operating base at 2,300 meters altitude, while the temperature outside fell steadily toward the kind of cold that made rifles behave differently than their specifications claimed. "How many times have you done this?" he said. "Not the shot. This. New unit, new name, cover file." A very long silence. "Enough times," she said, "to know what I'm looking for." "And what are you looking for?" She looked up again, held his gaze this time. "Whether an experienced unit can be made to dismiss a capability it doesn't recognize," she said. "Whether the structure, the hierarchy, the assumptions, the social weight of who belongs and who doesn't, whether it overrides observation, whether men who are trained to see accurately can choose not to, when choosing not to is more comfortable." Pryor sat with that for a long time, and, he said, "Ask me after tomorrow," she said. She stood up. tucked the databook under her arm. "Sergeant Pryor," she said, "I appreciate the concern. The shot is 3,247 meters, in conditions that will make most of the corrections approximate at best. I suggest you get some sleep." She walked toward the exit. He watched her go. The back of his neck felt the way it did before every engagement he'd survived. "Hail." She stopped, but didn't turn. "Whatever you're doing," he said, "be careful with it." She pushed through the door into the dark and the cold, and the door settled shut behind her like punctuation. The propane heater hissed in the corner. The bare bulbs swayed slightly in a draft from somewhere. Pryor sat alone in the rifle bay for a while, looking at the empty table where her databook had been, at the faint pencil impressions it had left on the surface from pages pressed hard enough to transfer. He could read one number clearly, transferred ghost-like through the page pressure. "Sentinel by He sat with it. Then he got up, turned off the lights, and went to get what sleep he could. They moved to the firing position at 0315. The ridgeline selected for the shot was a 20-minute traverse from the FOB through terrain that had not been formally cleared of ice hazard. Cassidy went first. She moved in the dark without a light source, reading the ground by the difference in the way compressed snow felt underfoot versus loose accumulation, adjusting her route 3 times without stopping. Pryor, directly behind her, watched her do this and said nothing. Danforth had initially refused to come. Colburn had told him to come anyway. They reached the firing position at 0341, a natural depression in the rock, perhaps 60 centimeters of shelter from the wind if you were prone, with a clean line of sight northeast across the valley. Cassidy put her equipment down. She stood for 2 full minutes doing nothing but looking. "What's she doing?" Hartley whispered. "Looking," Pryor said. "At what?" "Everything." She opened the case. The rifle was a bolt-action, heavy caliber, with a scope that had been fitted with custom corrections markings on the elevation turret in increments that none of them recognized as standard. She removed a small device from her chest pocket, a Kestrel atmospheric meter, older model, the kind that gave raw data without interpretation. She held it at arm's length for 45 seconds, watching the display. Then, she opened the data book. The calculations from the night before took up 2 full pages. She added 4 more lines, adjusted 2 previous figures, and then set it aside. She lay down behind the rifle. "Range check," she said. Webb stepped forward with the laser rangefinder. 3,241 on a direct line. Accounting for the angle of the ridgeline closer to 3,247 actual flight path. She nodded. Had already written 3,247 at the top of the page. "Wind at our position is 26 knots, gusting to 34. She said it to herself, not to them. Temperature is -14 Celsius, elevation 2,340 meters, target elevation 2,610. She adjusted the scope turret with precise, small movements. Once, again, a third time. Each adjustment was a fraction of what any of them expected. "That's a lot of elevation compensation," Webb said. "Less than you'd think," she said. "At this distance, the bullet will be in the air for approximately 4.2 seconds. Wind drift at a sustained 20 knots across the flight path would be at this caliber, and velocity," she paused, checking the book, approximately 3.8 meters, "but the wind is not sustained at 20. It varies. I need a lull." "You need a lull," Danforth repeated. His voice had lost some of its usual color, not all of it, some. "The gusts run in cycles of approximately 90 seconds based on the last 40 minutes of data. There's a 7 to 12 second window between them." She settled her cheek against the stock. "I'll use that window." "And if you miss?" Colburn said. She didn't answer immediately. She was watching something through the scope, not the target, not yet, but the ground between here and there, the way the snow moved in patterns that told her things about the air above them. There was a particular behavior that windswept terrain produced at this altitude. The snow on the exposed ridges moved differently than the snow in the depressions, and the transition zones between the two told you things about wind speed at intermediate distances that no ground station could capture. She was reading those transition zones the way a navigator reads water. "I won't miss," she said. It didn't sound like arrogance. It sounded like a measurement. Danforth shifted his weight. He was trying to identify what was wrong with her confidence, whether it was the delusional kind, which would be explainable and therefore manageable, or the other kind. He could not identify which it was, and this was itself uncomfortable. The temperature was -14 and falling. Her breath came out in slow, even plumes that she timed with the rhythm of the wind. Pryor watched her chest rise and fall. The pace was wrong for the conditions, too slow, too deliberate. The pace of someone who had done this before in conditions worse than this, and had learned to slow the body down before the moment demanded it. The science of this was not mysterious. Under extreme stress, the body accelerates heart rate, respiration, fine motor degradation. The shooter who cannot manage this loses the shot. There are pharmacological approaches, mechanical aids, training protocols. What Cassidy Hale was demonstrating was none of these. It was the thing that cannot be taught and can only be acquired by standing in exactly this kind of cold, at exactly this kind of distance, more times than anyone had written down. Her index finger rested on the trigger guard, not the trigger, the guard, a distinction that mattered. Colburn watched her and said nothing more. He had commanded enough people to know when someone had a different relationship with a task than other people. He had not seen this particular relationship before. He filed it. Danforth crouched beside a rock and stopped talking. The mountains watched. The wind moved through them, indifferent. The window opened at 0502. She had been waiting for 11 minutes, perfectly still. Her gloved hands on the rifle, her eye at the scope, her breathing a thing she had separated from herself and placed somewhere outside the moment. The temperature had dropped 2 degrees in that time. She had not moved. The wind dropped. Not gone, not stopped, but reduced. The way a river reduces to a trickle between storms, a breathing space between one force and the next. Her right index finger moved. Not quickly. Nothing in this was quick. The trigger of a precision rifle at this distance is not pulled in the way. That word implies it is compressed, slowly, incrementally, a fraction of a millimeter at a time, until the mechanism releases, not because you decided it should, but because it was inevitable. The body has to disappear from the process entirely. The mind has to go somewhere else and leave only the geometry. The relationship between this muzzle and that point in space 3,247 meters away, crossed by temperature gradients and wind corridors and the slow curve of the Earth itself. She let out half a breath, held the rest. The trigger broke. The rifle spoke once, a single crack that the mountains swallowed whole. The round was in the air, at a muzzle velocity of approximately 900 meters per second, and accounting for drag at altitude and temperature, the flight time to 3,247 meters was 4.1 seconds. In those 4.1 seconds, the wind, which had started to rebuild the moment she fired, would attempt to move the bullet laterally. The bullet, because of the spin imparted by the rifling, would resist some of this movement and submit to some of it. The compensation she had calculated was not for what the wind would do, but for what she had predicted the wind would try to do and how much the bullet would ignore it. She had predicted these things at 0200, with a worn data book and 11 years of accumulated judgment that did not appear in any file with her name on it. The 4.1 seconds passed. No one spoke. On the valley floor, in the cold blue dark before dawn, the wind moved through the scrub brush and the frozen creek beds and the abandoned goat trails and the mountainside where a man had been crouching with a radio for 6 weeks. A faint, distant sound reached them. Not a bang, not an explosion, just contact, metal on something solid, the particular sound that carries differently than everything else in cold alpine air. Then, nothing. Webb was at the spotting scope. He had been at the spotting scope since she settled into position. He had been watching through it for 11 minutes without once removing his eye. He was still watching when the sound came back. He said nothing. He rechecked. His hand moved to the elevation control of the spotting scope. He looked again. Confirmed impact, he said. His voice was completely flat, the tone of a man who has been very certain about something for a long time and has just been shown that his certainty was approximately the size of a grain of sand. Nobody moved. Cassidy Hale let out the rest of the breath she'd been holding. She opened the bolt. The casing ejected into the snow. She watched it for a moment, the way it sat there, still warm, steam rising from it in the frozen air. Then she closed the bolt, picked up her data book, made 3 notations. She did not look at any of them. 11 men. 11 men who had seen things that would not leave them, who had made decisions in situations that most people would not survive long enough to regret, who had been tested in environments designed by geography and adversarial intent to break them. Not one of them spoke. Danforth was on his knees behind the rock he'd crouched against. He had been about to make a remark when the trigger broke. The remark had never arrived. He was still in the position of someone about to speak, with the words stuck somewhere between his chest and his mouth, unable to go forward or back. Hartley had taken 3 steps toward the spotting scope and stopped. He was frozen mid-step, like a man who has just remembered he forgot something, except he could not identify what it was. Webb lowered himself from the spotting scope and sat down in the snow. He put his hands on his knees. He looked at them for a moment, then looked at the valley. Colburn walked to the edge of the firing position and looked north. He could see nothing. The target position was too far, the dark too complete, but he looked anyway. It was what his body decided to do, and he let it. Pryor turned his head and looked at Cassidy Hale. She was packing her equipment with the same quiet efficiency she'd arrived with. Databook first, squared to the edge of the case, then the atmospheric meter, placed precisely into its slot. Then the rifle, broken down into 2 sections with practiced movements that made no wasted motion. She worked without hurry. She worked without ceremony. Colburn turned back from the edge. He looked at her. He opened his mouth, then closed it. The unit's standing orders and his 19 years of procedure gave him no ready template for this moment. He had never needed one. 3247, Webb said, from where he was sitting in the snow. He wasn't talking to anyone. He was saying it to make it real. 3247 meters. The wind returned. It came back the way it had always been, immediate, indifferent, without apology. Danforth stood up slowly. His face had the look of something reconfigured. Not broken, not humbled, exactly. Just rearranged into a shape that was truer than the one it had been wearing for 27 years. He opened his mouth, closed it, opened it again. Impossible, he said, quietly, not as a protest, as the closest word available for what he was experiencing. Cassidy Hale snapped the case shut. She picked it up in her right hand, low, at her side, and stood. Sergeant Colburn, she said, I'll write up the shot data and submit it to Captain Forsyth by 0800. She walked past all of them. Nobody said anything. They watched her go back down the ridgeline in the pre-dawn dark, stepping through the snow with the same unhurried precision she'd arrived with, and the darkness closed around her like water closing over a stone, and the only evidence she had been there at all was the single spent casing sitting in the snow beside Lane 7, still warm, steam rising from it in a thin, disappearing line. Captain Forsyth came to the FOB at 0730. He was not alone. Beside him was a lieutenant colonel named Stephen Aldrich, who had been in country for 3 days and who wore his rank with the careful, undemonstrative manner of a man who is only the second most dangerous person in any room he enters. He was 53 years old. He had the kind of eyes that indicated he had spent a very long time learning to see things accurately. Colburn assembled the platoon in the operations hut. This was unusual. Assemblies in the operations hut were reserved for mission briefs and, occasionally, for things that required privacy. Aldrich stood at the front. He did not use a laser pointer. Last night's operation was successful, he said. As of 0612 this morning, the intelligence network, relying on that forward observer, has been disrupted, and 3 planned attacks on supply routes have been effectively preempted. That's a direct outcome of a confirmed engagement at a distance that sets a new record for an operation of this type in this theater. He paused. Nobody filled the pause. The soldier who conducted that engagement is not who her file indicates she is, he said. That is by design, and the design was sanctioned at a level above my pay grade, which is saying something. A brief pause that might have been amusement. I have been authorized to provide a partial disclosure. He looked at Cassidy Hale, who was standing at the left end of the assembly line. She was looking at the wall. Specialist Cassidy Hale, Aldrich said, is a cover identity. The individual behind it has a confirmed operational record spanning 11 years in roles that I am not at liberty to fully specify. Previous assignment: a precision engagement program that was officially decommissioned 4 years ago. That decommissioning was public. The program's continuation under a different designation was not. The room was doing that particular thing rooms do when everyone in them has a very large thought they are choosing not to speak. Her previous confirmed engagement distances, Aldrich continued, include 2 operations above 2,800 meters and 1 in a different theater at 3,109 meters. Last night was her longest shot on record. It was also, and here his voice shifted slightly in a way that was not quite admiration but was adjacent to it, conducted without the computational assistance that the program normally deploys for solutions at that distance. She used a personal data book and 11 years of atmospheric instinct. Danforth was standing at attention. His face had gone through several expressions in the previous 30 seconds and had settled on something that had no ready name. Her presence here was not incidental, Aldrich said. She was assigned to evaluate this unit's cohesion and operational readiness under conditions of social pressure and uncertainty. Specifically, how a unit responds to an unknown quantity in their environment, whether they defer to procedure or to assumption, whether they can be made to dismiss a capability because of how it arrives. He looked at the unit. The results of that evaluation are in my hands, he said. We'll discuss them in detail in separate sessions. For now, it's sufficient to say that Specialist Hale's assessment will influence your next assignment designation. A pause. Questions? Silence. Dismissed, Aldrich said. The hut emptied slowly. Danforth was the last man standing when Cassidy Hale passed the row of chairs where his kit was stacked. He had not yet picked it up. He was standing with his hands at his sides and his jaw set at an angle that suggested he was constructing something internally and did not yet have all the materials. "Hale," he said. She stopped. He did not look at her directly. He looked at a spot approximately 45 degrees to her left, which was the closest he could manage. What I said on the range. The drop the gun thing. She waited. I shouldn't have. He stopped. Started again. That was out of line. A very long pause. Noted, she said. She started walking. That's it? Hartley said from the doorway, where he had been pretending not to listen. Just noted? She didn't slow down. What else would you like me to say? I don't know. Maybe that it's okay. Maybe something. She stopped at the door. Turned, not fully. Profile. You said drop the gun, she said. I didn't. That's sufficient. She pushed through the door. Hartley stood in the frame for a moment, then looked at Danforth. I think, Hartley said, carefully, that we got evaluated and failed. We got evaluated, Danforth said. Whether we failed or not is apparently above our pay grade. He picked up his kit, set it back down, sat in the chair it had been resting against. He was not, by any standard he'd previously applied to himself, a man who needed to sit when things happened. He was the kind of man who did things when things happened, which was why he'd been the first one on the range with a comment, and the last one in the hut with an apology that had arrived in the wrong order and at the wrong size. He sat for a while. Then he picked up his kit and left. Webb was outside, near the supply depot, when Pryor found him. He was standing with his coffee and looking at the northern ridgeline, which was now fully lit by a low winter sun that made the snow look like something valuable. I've been shooting at range for 14 years, Webb said when Pryor came to stand beside him. I know. My personal best is 2,100 meters. I'm proud of it. It's a legitimate number. It is. 2,100 meters. He said it again, not deprecatingly, just measuring it against something. She used a data book. A worn data book, Pryor said. Right. Webb drank his coffee. A worn data book. They stood in silence for a while. The sun moved. The ridgeline remained. Is she still here? Webb asked. Pryor had checked at 0720. I don't think so. They stood in silence a while longer. The supply depot was generating a low mechanical hum from the generator inside. A private moved through the far end of the compound, head down against the wind. The world was continuing in the way it always continues, indifferent to the recalibrations occurring inside the people moving through it. I've been thinking, Pryor said, about the range yesterday. The way she shot. She shot badly, Webb said. She shot to a specific standard of visible inadequacy, Pryor said. There's a difference. Webb turned his head. The 2 corrections at the end, Pryor said. She caught the wind shift 30 seconds before anyone else, and she logged it. The whole time the misses, the near hits, she was logging everything. Not results, process. She was collecting data on the range conditions and using the session as cover. Webb was quiet for a long time. She was never practicing, he said. She was never practicing, Pryor confirmed. She was. Webb stopped, started again. She was observing. She came onto the range already knowing what the range was. She used our expectations as, he stopped again. Camouflage, Pryor said. That's Webb set down the coffee cup on the depot's outer wall, picked it back up. That's actually brilliant and deeply irritating. I walked away thinking we'd established something about her, about what she was capable of. And she walked away having established something about us, about what we were capable of overlooking. Webb looked at the ridgeline again. Should I be embarrassed? He said. We all should be, Pryor said. Whether we choose to be is the more interesting question. I should have been the one to step up when Forsyth named the distance, Webb said. Yes, Pryor said. I was calculating odds instead of asking whether they applied. Another long silence. Well, Webb said finally, and drank the rest of the coffee. He didn't say anything else. He didn't need to. The ridgeline was still there, patient and enormous and completely unconcerned with the calibrations of men. The wind came through the compound in a long, sustained gust that rattled the supply depot's corrugated siding and pushed the loose surface snow across the ground in shifting, transparent curtains. Pryor watched the snow move and thought about the things that are invisible until they decide not to be, and about how long invisibility can last if you do it right, and about a data book with 11 years of atmospheric observations written in handwriting too small to read from a distance. Are there others? Webb said. Like her. I don't know, Pryor said. But possibly. Possibly. Webb picked up his cup, found it empty, set it back down. Then we should probably be better than we were yesterday, he said. Yes, Pryor said. We probably should. She left at 0900. There was no ceremony, no announcement. At 0845, Lieutenant Colonel Aldrich signed a transfer order that Forsyth delivered to the supply desk. At 0852, Cassidy Hale emerged from the rifle bay with her case and her kit, both of them in the same condition they'd arrived in. Nothing added, nothing left behind. Pryor was at the gate. He hadn't planned to be there. He had been walking to the operations hut for reasons he would later fail to reconstruct, and the route had brought him past the gate, and she was there, and he stopped. Aldrich didn't say where you're going, he said. No, she agreed. She set down the case, checked the lock on the latch, habit, not necessity, picked it back up. Are you going to do this again? He said. The same thing, different unit. She considered the question with the same careful attention she'd given to atmospheric data and curvature corrections. That's not something I can answer, she said. I know. He paused. I'm asking anyway. A beat. There are units, she said slowly, that need to know what they don't know, that need to be shown the thing they're dismissing before they dismiss the wrong thing in the wrong moment. She looked past him, at the ridgeline. That's a specific kind of useful. And the 3,247 meters? That was the job. The evaluation was the job, he said. The shot was. The shot was also the job. The corner of her mouth moved. Not quite a smile. The ghost of the thing a smile is made of. Some jobs have two components. She walked through the gate. The supply vehicle was waiting 30 meters out, a standard transport, engine running, producing a thin white exhaust cloud that the wind took apart immediately. The driver did not get out. He had been told to be ready at 0900, and it was 0901. Pryor watched her cross the distance. Behind him, he heard boots on the packed snow, and turned to find Danforth, Webb, Hartley, and 4 others from the platoon standing in a loose cluster at the gate. Nobody had announced anything. They had simply arrived, in the way that people sometimes arrive at a moment because something in them knows it is a moment worth arriving at. Cassidy Hale reached the vehicle. She put her case in the back, with the practiced economy of someone who has loaded equipment in vehicles that were moving before she was done. She climbed into the front. The door closed. The vehicle pulled away. None of them said anything. The vehicle crossed the valley floor, growing smaller against the white. The wind came across from the north, and the surface snow lifted and shifted, softening the tracks behind the vehicle until they were gradients rather than marks, and then suggestions rather than gradients, and then the wind took the last of them, and there was nothing left. "Ghost sniper?" Hartley said. He said it very quietly. Nobody confirmed or denied it. Nobody needed to. The tracks were gone. The mountains were still there. The snow came down, fine and windswept, covering everything equally: the firing position, the rifle bay, the packed surface of the gate road, the spent casing at Lane 7, which someone would find in spring when the melt came, and which would be puzzling to whoever found it because the brass was stamped with a caliber that didn't match any weapon assigned to this unit and that didn't appear in any incentive. Manifest. Someone would ask about it. There would be no record. There was never a record. The wind moved through the valley the way it always moves, without destination, without memory, covering the ground behind it as if nothing had been there. But the unit stood at the gate for 7 minutes after the vehicle disappeared. 7 minutes, in -14 degrees, in a wind that made their eyes water and their exposed skin ache. Nobody called them in. Nobody moved. They stood there with the mountains in front of them and the specific silence of men who have just recalibrated something fundamental about what they thought they knew. It would change things. Not immediately. The adjustment in a man's understanding of his own assumptions doesn't produce a dramatic before and after. It works the way weather works, gradually, through repeated pressure, until something in the architecture shifts. Danforth, in the months that followed, would become a different kind of marksman. Not technically different. His groups at distance were already excellent, but differently careful. He started keeping the analytical data book he had always gestured toward, and he started actually reading it. He started asking questions about conditions he had previously assumed he understood. People noticed. He did not explain why. Webb applied for a long-range precision course that he had previously considered unnecessary given his existing numbers. The application went through a different channel than normal and was approved within 48 hours, which was faster than applications of that type were normally approved, and he noted this but said nothing about it. Hartley, who had laughed loudest on the range, requested a transfer to a different platoon 3 weeks later. Not out of shame, exactly. Out of the particular clarity that comes when you understand, precisely and without softening, the specific version of yourself that a moment has revealed. He wanted to be somewhere he could become something different before the version that existed in that rifle bay became the permanent one. Pryor stayed. He was a stayer by nature. He stayed, and he watched. And when the next detachment arrived, 6 weeks after Cassidy Hale's vehicle had crossed the valley and disappeared into the hills, he was the first one at the gate. Not to welcome. Not